Your best engineer is the worst person to train a new hire. That's not an insult. It's a documented cognitive bias, and it has a name: the curse of knowledge. Once you know something well, you lose the ability to imagine not knowing it. The steps that took you years to learn start to feel obvious. You forget which parts were ever hard. And that gap between what you know and what a beginner knows becomes invisible to you, precisely because you know so much. This costs real money, not just frustration. Slow onboarding means new hires take longer to become productive. Confusing training documents mean the same questions get asked over and over, eating up senior time that should go toward actual work. Muddled executive presentations mean strategy doesn't land, and teams execute on a version of the plan they half understood. Frustrated customers churn faster when support scripts fail them. None of this shows up as a single dramatic failure. It shows up as 1,000 small frictions, all traceable back to the same root cause. The people who know the most are the ones least equipped to explain it clearly. This isn't a character flaw. It isn't arrogance. It isn't laziness. It's a wiring problem in how expert brains process familiar information, and it quietly wrecks training programs, onboarding docs, executive presentations, and customer support scripts in almost every company on Earth. Let's start with the experiment that proves it, because it's one of the cleanest demonstrations of a cognitive bias in the history of psychology. Researchers split people into two roles: tappers and listeners. The tapper's job was simple. Pick a well-known song, something like Happy Birthday or the national anthem, and tap out the rhythm on a table with one finger. No humming, no singing, just tapping. The listener's job was to guess the song from the taps alone. Before the test began, the researchers asked the tappers to predict how often listeners would guess correctly. The tappers were confident. They said around 50%. Half the time, they figured, the listener would nail it. The actual result was nowhere close. Listeners guessed correctly about 2% of the time. 2% against a prediction of 50. Why the massive gap? Because when a tapper taps out a song, they hear the whole thing in their head. The melody, the rhythm, the words, all playing simultaneously while their finger taps the beat. To the tapper, the song is unmistakable. It would be almost impossible for them to imagine hearing just the taps, stripped of every other layer of information their brain is supplying automatically. But that's all the listener gets. Disconnected knocks on a table. No melody, no context. Just taps, and from taps alone, almost nothing recognizable. The tapper wasn't being careless. They weren't bad at the task. They simply could not simulate what it's like to not have the song already loaded into their head. Their own knowledge made them terrible judges of what someone else could perceive. That's the curse of knowledge in its purest form, and it isn't confined to a psychology lab. It runs through your organization every single day. Think about what's actually happening inside an expert's brain. When you first learn a skill, every step requires conscious effort. You think about each one. It's slow, deliberate, exhausting, but repeat it enough times, and your brain compresses that whole sequence into something psychologists call a chunk. Instead of 10 separate steps, it becomes one smooth, automatic motion. You stop noticing the individual pieces because your brain has stopped processing them individually. Everyday life gives you a smaller version of this constantly. Think about driving a car. When you first learned, checking mirrors, managing the pedals, and steering all required separate conscious effort. Now you do all three at once without thinking, while also holding a conversation. Typing is the same. Riding a bike is the same. Your brain takes a sequence of effortful steps and welds them into a single automatic motion. That welding is what makes you fast and competent. It's also exactly what makes it hard to describe the sequence to a beginner, because the sequence no longer exists in your head as separate pieces. It exists as one smooth chunk. This is efficient. It's also why an expert can perform a complex task while barely thinking about it. But it comes at a cost. The expert loses conscious access to the pieces. They can't easily unpack the chunk back into its components because their brain no longer represents it that way. Ask them to explain step by step, and they'll skip steps without realizing it. Not because they're hiding information, Because the information isn't sitting there as separate steps anymore, it's been compressed into a single automatic unit. Layer on top of that a second effect. Once you know the answer, it's hard to remember what it felt like not to know it. Your brain quietly overwrites your memory of your own confusion. This is why experienced employees often insist a task is easy or intuitive, while the new hire in front of them is visibly struggling. The expert isn't lying. The difficulty has been paved over by years of fluency. Notice the parallel to the tapping experiment directly. The tappers were confident. They predicted 50% success, not because they were arrogant, but because the song was so clear in their own heads that a 50% guess rate felt conservative. Ask any expert to rate how clear their own documentation is, and you'll get the same overconfidence. They're not lying about how clear it feels to them. It genuinely is clear to them. That's exactly the problem. Clarity is not a property of the document. It's a property of the gap between the document and the reader's existing knowledge, and the writer is the one person in the room who cannot measure that gap accurately. This is also why asking an expert, "Is this clear?" is close to useless as a quality check. Of course it's clear to them. The real test is handing the material to someone who doesn't yet share the expert's mental model, and watching where they stall. Put those two things together, compressed automatic knowledge and a faded memory of your own learning curve, and you get someone who is brilliant at the work and nearly incapable of teaching it well. That combination shows up constantly in workplaces, and it's worth walking through a few concrete places it hides. Start with documentation. A senior engineer sits down to write a setup guide for new hires. They know the codebase cold, so when they write the guide, they skip the steps that feel too obvious to mention. Install this dependency, obviously. Configure this environment variable, obviously. Run this specific command in this specific order, obviously. Except none of it is obvious to someone on day one. The new hire hits a wall at step 3, because step 3 assumed knowledge nobody told them they needed. The guide isn't badly written because the engineer is careless. It's badly written because the engineer's expertise makes the gaps invisible to them. Move to management. A manager rolls out a new process at a team meeting. They've been thinking about this process for weeks. They know the reasoning behind every decision. So they explain it fast, using internal shorthand that makes total sense to them and to anyone else who is in the planning meetings. To everyone else in the room, it's a blur of acronyms and half context. The manager isn't trying to confuse anyone. They've simply forgotten what it's like to hear this information for the first time, because they've been living inside it for weeks. But here's the part nobody expects. This isn't just a documentation problem or a meeting problem. It shows up in far more expensive places too. And it gets worse the higher up the org chart you go. Take executive presentations. This is one of the more expensive versions of the same problem. An executive stands in front of the company, or in front of investors, and walks through a strategy using terms that are second nature in the boardroom. Market positioning, vertical integration, total addressable market, runway. To the executive, these words are shorthand for entire conversations they've had dozens of times. To a large chunk of the audience, they're noise. People nod along, understand roughly a third of what was said, and leave the room without the clarity the presentation was supposed to create. The more senior the speaker, the more likely this is to happen, because seniority usually means more time spent living inside the jargon. Technical support is another place this shows up constantly, and it's especially costly because it touches customers directly. Support scripts and troubleshooting guides often get written by the engineers who built the product. They know exactly which error messages matter and which don't. They know the mental model of the system so well that they write instructions assuming the customer shares that mental model. A support script that says clear your cache and restart the service means something specific and complete to the engineer. To a frustrated customer with no technical background, it might as well be written in another language. Support tickets pile up not because customers are careless, but because the instructions were written by the one person in the building least equipped to imagine not understanding the system. And then there's subject matter expert-led onboarding generally, which is really the same failure repeated at scale. Companies naturally default to putting their most knowledgeable person in charge of training new employees. It sounds efficient on paper. Get the expert, save time, avoid the telephone game distortion of information passing through multiple people. In practice, it's often the slowest and least effective option available, because the expert is the person least able to see the material the way a beginner sees it. There's a broader pattern behind why companies keep falling into this trap. Promotions and seniority both track expertise. The person who's been at the company the longest, who understands the system best, is usually the person handed the microphone, the whiteboard marker, or the onboarding manual. It feels like the obvious choice. It's actually closer to a systematic mismatch between who has the knowledge and who has the perspective needed to transmit it clearly. Knowledge and teaching ability are not the same skill, and expertise in one doesn't guarantee competence in the other. The deeper the expertise, the more likely the blind spot, simply because there's more accumulated automatic knowledge sitting between the expert and a beginner's point of view. That mismatch repeats at every level of the org chart, from new hire buddy systems all the way up to the executive team. It would be reasonable to assume the fix here is simply hiring better communicators, or sending experts to a training the trainer course, or asking them to try harder to dumb it down. None of that reliably works. You can't coach someone out of a cognitive bias by asking them to be more self-aware about it, any more than you can ask someone to consciously unhear a melody they already know. The bias isn't a communication skill gap. It's a structural blind spot built into how expertise is stored in the brain. So the fix has to be structural too. Instead of asking the expert to imagine what confuses a beginner, put an actual recent beginner in the loop. Someone who learned the process in the last few weeks or months, not years ago, still remembers exactly where they got stuck. They remember which sentence in the manual made no sense. They remember which step they had to ask a coworker about because the instructions skipped it. The expert forgot all of that months or years ago. The recent learner hasn't had time to forget it yet. Picture how this plays out concretely. A software team asks its most senior engineer to write the setup guide for new developers. The guide is thorough by expert standards. It's also riddled with invisible gaps, because the engineer's fingers know the muscle memory of setup, even when the guide's words don't spell it out. A new hire follows the guide and gets stuck at a step that assumes a local tool is already configured, something the engineer configured so long ago they forgot it wasn't default. Now change one thing. Before that guide goes live, hand it to the next new hire, someone who joined 3 weeks earlier, and ask them to follow it literally, flagging every point of confusion in real time. They hit the same wall almost immediately because they remember not having that tool configured either. They add a single missing line. Install this tool first. Here's the command. That one line, invisible to the expert, obvious to the recent learner, is the difference between a new hire finishing setup in 20 minutes or losing half a day stuck on a support ticket. Run that loop with every new hire, and the document gets sharper every cycle. Not because anyone became a better writer, because the review process kept routing through someone close enough to the confusion to still see it. The same fix works for executive presentations. Before a strategy deck goes to the whole company, have someone outside the leadership circle, someone who wasn't in the planning conversations, read it, and mark every term or slide that doesn't make sense without extra context. That person isn't less capable than the executive. They're simply positioned differently, close enough to a beginner's eye view to catch what insiders can no longer see. It works for support scripts too. Have someone who recently joined the support team, not the engineer who built the feature, write or edit the troubleshooting steps customers actually read. They'll write in plain language by default because they were recently a person without the mental model, not someone trying to reconstruct what that felt like from memory. This costs almost nothing. It doesn't require better writers. It doesn't require the expert to become someone they're not. It just requires routing the feedback through the right person, whoever is currently closest to the confusion, not whoever is furthest from it. Here's the one thing worth saying plainly. Most companies solve documentation problems by throwing more expertise at them, when the actual fix is throwing more freshness at them. The same principle applies beyond onboarding manuals. If you want to know what's actually unclear in a process, a presentation, or a support script, don't ask the person who mastered it years ago. Ask the person who's still climbing the learning curve right now. They're the only one in the building who can still see the gaps, because they haven't had time to forget them. If you manage people, the practical move is simple. Stop assuming your most knowledgeable person is automatically your best teacher. Build a habit of routing new material, training docs, onboarding guides, internal explainers through someone who just learned it before it goes out to the next batch of new hires. Do this consistently, and onboarding time drops, support tickets drop, and fewer strategy meetings end in confused nods. The expert builds the knowledge. The recent learner builds the bridge to it. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.